Hello, Mark here from PresentDayProduction, and today we're going to talk about the basics of phase.
Set phases to stun.
Thanks. Not phased by anything these days. So phase, what is it? Why is it so boring? Well, it is a bit boring. It's one of those technical subjects, but if you know a little bit about phase, you can avoid certain problems in the studio and you can use it to huge advantage in the studio as well. So let's first talk a little bit about what phase is, what phase means. Basically, it's the relationship between two sound sources. So if you're recording one thing in mono, at the moment I'm recording my voice on this microphone in mono, I don't have to worry about phase at all. If I was to start recording my voice with two microphones, say I had another one here, then I'd have to worry about the phase relationship between those two microphones, because that one might sound great on its own, that one might sound great on its own, but I might find when I mix the two together, something disappears or it sounds a little bit like I'm in a drain pipe or something like that. And that would be solved by just moving one of the microphones backwards and forwards until it doesn't sound like I'm down a drain pipe anymore. This is quite common when you're recording drums. If you've got a microphone on top of a snare and a microphone on the bottom of a snare, you'd normally reverse the polarity of the bottom microphone. That will then change the phase relationship between the two microphones, which will inherently want to, because one's one way, one's the other way, that'll invert the waveform and you tend to get cancellation. So normally you'd reverse the polarity of the bottom mic on the snare. Confused already? Let's go to a really simple demo. So I've got two acoustic guitars playing, two identical acoustic guitars playing out of Logic at the moment. One is on channel 1, as you can clearly hear, and one is on channel 2, as you can clearly hear, and they are identical. They're exactly the same. So playing one on its own, that's fine. Play the second one on its own, that's fine. We can see the activity going on the meters. If I play them both together, let's push one up and then push the second one up, you'll hear that because they're perfectly in phase, what will happen is they'll get louder, and when they're at the same position on the output, when both phases are at the same position, then we'll get double the volume. So let's push the second one up. There we go, twice as loud. Bring the second one down again. So what happens if I invert the polarity of the second microphone? Well, that changes the phase relationship between the two. So let's just take everything out. Let's invert the polarity on the second microphone. Let's have a listen to the first microphone. Sounds the same. Let's have a listen to the second microphone. Sounds the same. That's because there's only one. There's still only one. If there's only one mono source, you don't have to worry about phase. It's when you've got more than one source you need to worry about it. So let's put channel 1 up to unity, which is easier said than done. There we go, we're on 0. Now listen to what happens now that we've reversed the polarity of channel 2. Listen to what happens when I push that up to the same position. As we go up and up and up, instead of getting louder, it gets quieter. And then when we get to 0, he says, there we go, it completely cancels out. Now you can't hear anything. It's still playing. Look at the meters. We've got the meter on Logic there showing us it's still going. Meters on the desk are both still going. But if you look at the output meter on Logic, there's nothing coming out. The reason there's nothing coming out is because channel 2 is now entirely out of phase with channel 1. So the first microphone recording is completely out of phase with the second microphone recording, and when they're played back at the same level, they've cancelled each other out completely. You can see there's nothing on the output meter of Logic at all. Now if I take channel 2 or channel 1 out of the equation, let's pull channel 2 down, you can see we've got our meters back on the output of Logic, and we've still got our guitar coming out of channel 1. We've still got our guitar coming out of channel 2. It has been all along. It's just that when you combine the two is when it disappears. So that's how important it can be to get phase right. If something's massively out of phase, You could, in a worst case scenario, end up with it not coming out of the speakers at all when you play something in mono. And best case scenario, you get portions of the sound missing, or it could just sound a bit weird. It's a lot of people are very sensitive to phase. So when you listen to music on stereo speakers, when you're mixing, the easiest way to be aware of if anything's happening strangely phase-wise is to use the mono button. If you've got a mono button on your monitor controller, or you can mono the output of your DAW, or you're mixing on a desk and you've got a mono on the stereo bus on the desk, the mono button is your friend. Always check your mixes in mono, because you might find that suddenly the guitars in stereo, you've got two guitar tracks and one's panned hard left and one's panned hard right, and it sounds absolutely massive. And then when you press the mono button, it sounds thin and horrible. It's like someone's just turned the guitar down and taken all the low end out. That's because you've got phase problems. That's when you need to go back to your mix and have a look at the issues and resolve them there. Otherwise, anyone listening in mono, which is quite a few people these days, mono kind of disappeared for a long time in the 90s because everyone was listening to FM radio and it was stereo. Earlier than that, you were listening to AM radio, which was just a mono radio speaker, and mixing in mono and making sure your tracks were mono compatible was hugely important. In the sort of late 80s and 90s, that became less and less important, but now lots of people are just listening on a single mono speaker on their phone, and once again, checking tracks in mono has become quite important again. So the mono button is your friend. Press that, always reference that when you're mixing, and if anything disappears or starts to sound a bit weird, then that's why. You can also notice it, some people are very sensitive to it. In fact, some people can even be made physically sick if something is out of phase. And I don't get physically sick, but I do start to feel a bit seasick and a bit queasy if something's out of phase. Quite often I'll walk into a shop and it'll be a charity shop or something like that, and they'll just have a cheap hi-fi, just a cheap stereo on a top shelf somewhere, and they'll be playing a CD that they've plucked out of their bin, or they'll be playing radio or something like that, and you'll walk past the speakers and it'll almost go it's just this really weird feeling. It's like the sound's coming from there, or just something really weird happens when you walk past it. And normally what I then do is normally ask the shop owner if I can have a quick peek around the back of their hi-fi and find that one of the speakers has been plugged in the wrong way round. So in the left speaker, the black wire will be in the black hole and the red wire will be in the red hole, and on the other speaker, the black wire will be in the red hole and the red one will be in the black hole. That means that everything you're listening to on that stereo is out of phase and just sounds weird. It just sounds horrible. So how can we deal with that? Well, there's various things you can do. So once again, it's only when one or more sound sources are combined when you're recording. So if you're recording a drum kit with a single microphone, you don't need to worry about phase at all. It's going to be entirely in phase because you've just got one mono source. If you're recording a drum kit with more than one microphone, which is quite often the case, then you need to pay attention to phase. Otherwise, your drums might sound great in isolation. If you solo the snare, it might sound fantastic. If you solo the overheads, it might sound fantastic. But then you find as soon as you bring the snare in with the overheads, it suddenly starts to sound a bit thin and the snare disappears a little bit. That means you've got phase problems. There are ways around that, and basically it's microphone placement. So like I said, with the top mic on a snare and the bottom mic on a snare, normally you reverse the polarity of the microphone on the bottom because they're pointing away from each other, and that will help avoid any phase issues. Another thing you can also do is that you can look at the waveform. Knowing that a waveform, an audio waveform, is peaks and valleys, you can look at the actual waveform in your DAW and you can align the waveform. So where you see the snare hit the peak in the overheads and you see the snare hit the peak on the snare track, you can line that peak up with the peak on the overheads, and that will bring your snare into phase with your overheads. And there are plugins that do that these days, and there are some DAWs, I think Harrison Mixbus is the only one I know of, that's actually got a phase algorithm in it which will spend a couple of minutes virtually listening to the track, and it'll actually work out the best kind of phase alignment and sort it all out for you. I haven't tried it, but I've heard reports that it's very, very good. Myself, I never align tracks in the DAW because I've never managed to do it and not actually end up with it sounding worse. And as we know, one of our mantras here at Present Day Production is that if it sounds good, it is good, and the only thing that matters is what you're hearing, not what you're looking at when you're mixing. So it might look perfect, but if it sounds wrong, then it's wrong. So every time I've tried to align tracks, it just never quite seems to work, certainly on drums. And if you've got more than snare, you're going to have kick, snare, overheads, tom mics, you might have a room mic. It's impossible to get every microphone perfectly in phase because they're different distances. Phase is a time difference. The time that when you hit the snare, the time the audio wave gets to hit one microphone, it's going to hit the snare microphone first, and then it's going to travel out and hit the overheads. On the way, it's going to bleed a little bit into the tom mics. There's various things you can do. You can try and make sure that when you mic the toms and the snare, that your mics are pointing in the same direction. So I generally tend to try and have them all pointing in the direction of the drummer, and that can help a little bit with phase alignment. But it's impossible to get every mic on a drum kit in phase. But it is important that you do check your mix in mono when you've set up, and that nothing's disappearing and nothing's sounding too thin. So we've seen how phase can be the enemy, and the phase relationship between two microphones can work against us to make our track sound awful. Is there any way in which phase can be useful? Well, yes. For example, armed with the knowledge that two identical signals with one with the polarity inverse cancel themselves out completely if something's completely out of phase with an identical signal. If you've got two identical signals that are completely out of phase with each other, they'll completely cancel out. Armed with that knowledge, we can actually use that knowledge should we want to cancel something out. When would you want to lose something? When would you want to make something disappear? Well, there's an age-old trick which quite a few vocalists use. I've used it before on trumpet, and that's if you're overdubbing a vocal. So you've got your backing track mixed, you're overdubbing your vocal, or you've got your backing track mixed, you're overdubbing a trumpet or any kind of solo instrument. A lot of musicians, myself included, don't like headphones. I hate wearing headphones. I don't mind headphones on the train or on the bus, but if I'm recording, I just don't like headphones. As soon as I put headphones on, I just feel like I'm listening to music and not performing it. I just feel detached from it in some kind of way. So I like to overdub. If I'm overdubbing something, I like to have the music blaring out of the speakers in the control room or coming through a PA in the live room or something like that to get a bit of a vibe going. That can obviously cause problems if you're using a microphone, because the microphone, that's why we wear headphones in the studio, because otherwise the microphone not only picks up the sound coming from your voice or from whatever instrument you're playing, but it also picks up a large amount of spill coming from the speakers. A certain amount of that spill is going to be out of phase with what you're doing, and it's probably going to be coming into the back of the microphone, and it's just going to sound awful. But there's a trick we can use using phase to eradicate the problem of people that don't like headphones or situations where you can't wear headphones. For example, a couple of years ago, we had a 30-piece choir in the live room that was singing along to a track we'd produced with a local songwriter and guitarist, and we hadn't got 30 pairs of headphones in the studio, and if we had 30 pairs of headphones, we certainly didn't have 30 headphone sockets to plug them in. So the backing track had to come through the PA, so you can keep it as low as possible and try and get everyone in the spirit of the song and sing it along, or you can crank it, and we cranked it, and there's a trick you can use armed with the knowledge about phase cancellation that can then make the spill from the speakers completely disappear. And it works like this. So if you imagine we're in the control room, which we are at the moment, there's two speakers there in the wall, one left, one right. I'm going to sing a song. I'm not going to sing a song because I can't sing, and if I did sing a song, you'd all switch off immediately. But I can sing a song in the control room with a microphone. This is very important, with a microphone on a stand, not handheld. So imagine this is on a stand. Sing a song in the control room, the music's blaring out the speakers, my voice is going into the microphone. Once I've finished the take, and I've done a good take, if I then press stop, go back to the beginning, record The microphone again on a second track, but just the spill. Now you need to keep everything at exactly the same volume. So you need to keep the speakers at the volume you were monitoring at. You need to keep everything at the same level. The microphone needs to be set to the same gain level on your preamp. So keep everything the same. The only difference the second time round is you don't sing. What we then capture is we capture what the microphone heard the first time around minus my voice, which means we can then reverse the polarity of that second track, and that will cancel itself out from the first recording, leaving only my voice. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So record your vocal with the spill from the speakers, leave everything the same, play the track back and record again, just recording the spill, and then reverse the polarity of the spill, and you can then remove it from the take with the vocal, and you're left with just the vocal. Now, a lot of it depends on microphone placement, where your speakers are, but generally as a rule it does work. I've done it with a trumpet player and it works. I've done it with various vocalists and it works. We did it with the choir in the live room and it worked. It wasn't perfect because the choir had left by the time I re-recorded the backing track through onto another channel. So ideally you want everyone to stay in the same place and keep as much the same as you possibly could, but they couldn't hang around. They had to go off and do gigs and things like that. But we did manage to get a lot of the spill out of the recording just by recording it again and then reverting the polarity. So as well as being the enemy, phase can also be your friend. So that's the basics on phase and how you can check for phase issues. As we've said, just a brief recap, the mono button is your friend, so always constantly check your mixes in mono. Even if you're confident they're never going to be played back in mono, check them in mono anyway. Always listen through monitors. Don't just mix on headphones, because quite often you won't notice any problems on headphones as much as you will on speakers, because there's the crossover between from left speaker going into right ear and right speaker going into left ear. There's a bit of crossover there, which you don't get from headphones. You can get software that models it, but it's not the same as just listening back on speakers. So mix on speakers, mix on headphones. Always check the mono button. If you've mic'd up a drum kit, get the drummer to play, come back in the control room, press the mono button and make sure that the snare's not disappearing or the kick suddenly doesn't lose all its low end or something like that. And just check for those problems. Remember that as well as being the enemy, phase can also be your friend. You can use phase cancellation to remove unwanted portions of tracks. And just kind of deliberately play some stuff out of phase and pan it hard left and pan it hard right and just listen to it, and it just sounds horrible. Get to know that sound and get to recognize that sound, and then next time you're in a shop and you walk past a cheap stereo system on the shelf and it makes you go, "Oh, where's the manager?" then just leave us a comment in the box below and we'll go and beat them up. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.